This is the Letters in Black and White series of the Dissidents Podcast. The following is the first in a series of podcast conversations with interesting people on the topic of race in America. Today's guest is Sahil Handa, a young graduate of Harvard College who has written stirring essays about the generation gap between the old and the young. Coleman Hughes, James Baldwin, in the infamous book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. Sahil brings the fresh perspective of an outsider to questions of the color line today. A writer, a philosopher, a Renaissance man. Welcome to a non-conformist Sahil Handa, who rejects the idea that a person's skin color ought to determine one's views. Welcome to this podcast series that my co-author, W.F. Twyman Jr., also known as Wink, and I are doing around our book, Letters in Black and White. And today I'm so excited to introduce Sahil Handa. As part of this series, we're interviewing people who have had an influence on our life. And Sahil has an influence on our writing. And we're going to get into that here in a little bit. But let me introduce Sahil. You are, in every sense of the word, plural. You are one of the most pluralistic people. I'm sure I'm missing out on a lot of stuff, but let me give you a little bit of the background as I know you just from a distance. You were born in London, Indian parents, spent 3 years in India. You were part of the team that started the Persuasion magazine. You are now into tech, creating a wallet, I believe it is, that you can tell us a little bit more about. You have spent your life backpacking, skydiving, and you have an affinity for dancing that I really want to hear more about. So you also you spent some time studying philosophy at Harvard. And as I already told our audience, your writing has influenced us. So before we get started on that, what did I miss about Sahil Handa? Tell us a little bit more about you and what drives you and your motivations.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very sweet of you. I think I do try to be plural. One of the people who I love the most is, or who I'm most inspired by is David Bowie. And he had this really wonderful way of living many, many, many lives. It's one of the last pieces I wrote was about him. And I'm deeply inspired by that sense of, I guess, that position that one takes onto the world, where they can kind of live many lifetimes in one. So I did grow up in London. I've spent time living in Dubai, living in India, living in Romania, living in Boston, and now living in New York. But I still go back and forth between a lot of them. And I'm working on a technology platform with a bunch of my closest friends from Harvard. And we are basically trying to think deeply around what social life will look like online in the future, and particularly how messaging will evolve. Something which has been pretty much consistently the same for 20 years, and I think needs to or could change in some really, really interesting ways. So that's what we're working on now. And in terms of missing parts of my background, there's not much. I used to do a lot of stuff in the theatre and acting world as well, and also the arts and painting and drawing world. So my background in school was all full of all the arts and dance, and then slowly veered into writing, and then that slowly veered into technology with a few things in the non-profit world. But I basically just like to make things with people that I love, and I like to engage with the biggest questions to the extent that my small mind can grapple with them.
India. So I've been to Dubai, did not live there. Spent time in several places in India, mostly Mumbai, but also Gujarat and then Hyderabad. Where did you spend most of your time?
Yeah, so I was staying for the 3 years that I was living there was in Bangalore. But I have family in Mumbai as well, and some family in different places. But the time that I was living there, most concretely, I was in Bangalore in a place called Whitefield. And so I went to an international school there, which was kind of a crazy experience. It was like the nurse had her own building. There were like 5 football pitches in the school. There were like it was a very, very global background, lots of different people, but really, really loved it and enjoyed it. So, but yeah, I was there from 2006 to 2009 or something like that.
Okay. So you were going to like high school during that time?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I was going to high school. So a very different kind of like form of life than the one that I'm now leading, but it was fun. It was like you would go to school, you would come home, and you would basically just play sport. That was kind of my few years that I spent there were just lots of playing outside, proper free range kind of childhood, which was great because you had the safety of knowing that you could be on the streets and it was okay, because of where we were living, which was very much a kind of an expat community, which meant that you could always go out to the streets. There'd be someone playing football, there'd be someone playing cricket, there'd be someone playing Xbox even, and it was a really nice way of living for a few years. Yeah.
So I lived up my father was an Air Force attaché, so we lived in Indonesia and we lived in what was then called Burma, now Myanmar. But that community is something that I think greatly shaped who I am and what I went on to do. So my background is I'm actually a China scholar, and through that and that relationship, I speak Chinese, worked in China, and I came back to I had this living in authoritarian regimes like Burma. I mean, when we lived in Burma, it was under the military junta. And then when we lived in Indonesia, I was in college, my family was there, but it was very much in disarray. It was during the 1997 financial crisis. So, a lot of corruption and whatnot. Yeah. And then, of course, there's China. And so from looking from the outside in, I had this kind of naive, I guess, ideal vision of America as this multicultural, diverse place that, democracy, all the like stuff. And I came back to the United States after living in Asia and predominantly in China where I was working. And I was like, this isn't, this isn't what's going on here. So, I kind of grew up in a I guess somewhat expat protected community.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's really, really interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think it does give you a different perspective. I spent some time on a gap year before Harvard, backpacking a lot through Southeast Asia, a very cliche kind of gap year experience. Grew long hair and took a backpack around with me. But it is always really interesting to see, especially living 1 foot inside the United States, 1 foot outside, to see the difference in the perspectives on America that people hold from inside it versus outside of it, because it's so different. And I think growing up in a place like that, where largely the people in the expat community were Americans, but they were, maybe born in America and moved out to become expats pretty young, or at least my friends had been there for most of their lives. And so it was a completely different way of thinking about the US and what it was to both leave and come back to it. And I think there was that real streak of, this is this incredible, optimistic, multicultural, diverse place. And that idealism was definitely something that was spoken about, and something that kind of imprinted itself upon me, even as I became aware of all the flaws as well inside the country. But yeah, it definitely stuck with me.
Yeah, I would say the reverse culture shock was perhaps more than even the original culture shock of moving overseas, because you have these ideals, and then your community is like so diverse, right? So that was the other thing too, is I was living in this very diverse community, where, my best friends were from all over the world. And I thought that the United States was a microcosm of that. And so this whole idea of diversity as it plays out now in the United States is actually foreign to me, because I just,
absolutely.
like, I feel like there's something different when you get to live like outside of your country and looking back in, Actually, Sahil, let me ask you. So living mostly in most of your life, I'm guessing in the UK, did you have kind of the same experience looking back into the UK as I did going back to the US?
Absolutely, yes. That's a really good question. I think there is something very different about going and living somewhere when you're young in a foreign country. Especially, I was in India between the ages of 8 and 11, which are really formative years, and years where you're making friends that you'll kind of be in contact with for a long time, but also you're just absorbing everything. And so when now I think of India, I distinctly remember I arrived in the country on Independence Day from Britain, and I was coming from Britain, and I got there on 15th of August 2006, and there were all of these dances taking place in the streets, and we were going into a home and people were cheering and all of this, and it was a strange feeling. At the time I was 8 years old, I didn't really know exactly what it meant. I didn't know why people were celebrating, but the color and the vibrancy and the life really stuck with me. And I think the more I was there, the more I became familiar with the very tense and also fascinating relationship between England, Britain, and India. And I slowly became, one, aware of that, but two, found that I was also a subject of that in some ways, because I had a British accent and I had brown skin and I was living in India, and people would call me sir, and they would treat me like an upper class citizen, right? And so there were a lot of these things that I think I was exposed to, base level just being inequality and how that manifests in such a clear way in a place like India. Whereas in England, it's definitely there, but it's just more closeted in a way. And so it was definitely a learning experience with regards to that. I definitely learned more about that relationship between the two countries. I was definitely just sucked into all of the craziness of the place and the vibrancy of it, and the pollution mixed with the joy, mixed with the love. And I think I also, grew a bit more of I wouldn't say thick skin in that, I wasn't, exposed to anything too crazy, but it was definitely a completely different way of living, and walking on the streets and seeing a completely different kind of person, being, in a sense, more of a minority in India than I was in the UK in some ways, because my school in the UK, which I went on to, was 60% South Asian, but they all spoke with British accents and came from a certain background. And my school in India was not like that at all. It was an international school. And then being in India itself, being in the city of Bangalore, was, people who yes, we had the same color skin, but that was probably the only thing that connected us. And so probably feeling more of a minority, more of an outsider there, in a way that I really enjoyed. And it probably gave me a bit of that travel bug too, that's been, that has stayed with me until now. So I think there's a lot of different things that kind of pass through there, but I do think it was formative. Yeah, absolutely.
Now that I'm on the call, do you think that it gave you more wisdom about race as a concept?
I think so. I think it gave me I was less particular, or less respect for race as a concept, basically less belief that it had to be the way that it was, and more contingency about how it could be seen, because India had all of its fair share of issues of caste and segregation and these kinds of things that could be defined in racial terms, and sometimes were, but they were very different racial terms than the ones used in London where I grew up, or the ones used when I came to Harvard and went to university here, that was a really different way of thinking about race. So I think it gave me less of a sense that these terms were fixed and much more of a sense that they were culturally specific.
I can relate to that so much, and we talk about that in our book. Query, did your classmates and professors at Harvard appreciate your different wisdom and perspective on race, or were they wedded to a certain preconception of race as a fixed idea?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, it's funny. I don't think many people would have asked a question about how India shaped a different perspective on race, because I think the American racial conversation is quite insular, and there's good reason for that in some ways, because there's a very particular racial story of subjugation and discrimination and slavery in the US that's a different history from the one found in different places, and probably has more of a lived sense because of the recency of Jim Crow, because of the recency of so many things in this country than it does elsewhere. But I think typical of the US in many things is the country is, and its people are sometimes inward looking, I think is fair to say, not across the board, but sometimes can be on certain political and cultural issues. And so I don't think I ever got asked that much about, how would your perspective on race in this country apply here? It was, how does your racial identity make you feel here? And that was a very different question that was asked. And I think it's probably a good question to ask too, but I would have liked to hear more of those other questions asked as well, because we probably would have gotten to better answers.
I so enjoy hearing that response, because one of my starting points in life, I grew up in a small town in Virginia, Chester, Virginia. But one of my operating principles in life has been, if there are over 40 million Black Americans, there are over 40 million life stories and experiences and perspectives. And so that's really the starting point for wisdom about race as I see it. I've never thought it was a wise idea to believe skin color equals views, skin color equals opinion, skin color equals oppression, nothing else matters. And it's interesting to me. And sometimes I wonder, for example, take Coleman Hughes and his testimony before the Congressional Subcommittee on Reparations for American Slavery. Your essay gave Jen and I such inspiration. And I thank you for that, because I think you helped to enlighten and to enrich the public square and the public understanding. So I thank you. And you could see when Coleman Hughes gave his testimony that historic, almost visceral impulse towards conformity, towards conformity in how we can speak about race or address race. You could sense that the individual named Coleman Hughes, who was a unique product of a unique home, unique grandparents and great-grandparents, ancestors from Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, ancestors from Puerto Rico, through his mom's line. None of that individuality was evident in the public clamor. All you sense was he has diverged from dogma, and so he must be viewed as a traitor, a race traitor. He must be outcast, if you will. And I liked your perspective on that skin color should not equal views. Could you expand upon that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I remember writing that piece now probably a few years ago, and I remember I don't normally write things that are that op-edy or that like clearly kind of clearly trying to state something. And I think it's because I prefer to disentangle an issue through many different threads and kind of like lay different arguments out and different ideas and complexities. But that one just seemed so clear cut that like there is no version of me that wouldn't really agree with the point I was trying to make. And I think the point that I was trying to make was just quite simply that, I mean, think what you want about the reparations debate. it is by no means, even if you are the most in favor person of racial reparations in this country, it is by no means a clear-cut issue, even amongst those who support them. And I probably count myself in some ways one of those people, but there's so much complexity there. How would reparations be provided? Who would be the people to be entitled to them? What would the form and structure be? Would it be a one-time thing or an ongoing thing? And those are all far more interesting questions because we're living them out. And it was incredible to me that somebody who's writing, I think at the time, I mean, this was also when Coleman was not as large of a star as he is right now. And so he was, he was basically a young writer who had had some success with a few pieces, and he had been brought up to do this. It took a lot of bravery, and he knew exactly what he was getting into. And it struck me as strange that people with far more wealth and success than him were so quick to call him these detestable things. And so just a very basic point that should be agreed upon by everyone in a liberal society, I think, which is just that one may take up a stance and that their skin color need not prevent them or prevent them from that stance being legitimate for them to hold. And the idea that he was some form of Uncle Tom, or that he was some traitor, and that he was some kind of, that just angered me in a way that I think made me want to write that piece. So, and I think I saw him, the next day. Funny enough, we hadn't met in person. I think I saw him the day it came out, which was strange because I didn't even know we were going to meet. We met at a conference, and he had seen the piece, and so we had a nice talk about it. But yeah,
that's good. That's good. Where do you? Well, do you think there's a way that impulse towards racial conformity will ever go away or dissipate?
It's a really interesting question. I think the versions of that I'm most hopeful for, I think it comes from two avenues. One is about conformity more broadly. That's the kind of like part of the question that I've spent most time, I guess, tackling, thinking about, writing about, is just how to tackle this fact of conformity, particularly amongst young people, but really across the board. And then there's the second part, which is about the racial component specifically, and the people who I look to kind of like shine light on that are less me and more friends of mine, like Thomas Chatterton Williams, and people of that mode. I mean, John McWhorter was another, of course. Glenn Lau is another, who I know, probably all in that same milieu. But Thomas is probably the one that I'm closest to, both, I guess, in both written propensities and also in ideals in some ways. And I think that what needs to be done is a kind of a bringing down of those barriers such that the labels just mean less. And it's hard to do that without sounding callous to basically generational suffering. And that's, I think, a line that Thomas really tries to strike, and strikes very well. And so I think it is possible, but I think it's that two-pronged effort, because a lot of conformity is just because there are all kinds of incentives towards conformity in this society in which we live. The racial component is a separate and more distortive component, but it needs to be kind of upended by its own logic, and needs to have an argument against it such that it can stick.
We really,
Jen, do you want to?
Yeah, we appreciate, I think where Wink and I kind of get to in our writing, in our relationship, and in our correspondence is along the same lines with, Thomas Chatterton Williams, that, can we even retire from this idea of race? How is that possible, and what would that look like? But I wanted to touch on something that you also mentioned, is not just racial, but also generational. So that's one of the things, and I'm going to let kind of Wink jump in on there, because he's the one who introduced me to this idea of generations and how ideals kind of skip generations. Like he's wondering, as we started to write, as we started to express kind of his generational ideas, his ideas with his family, younger family, and then how he thought, he thinks that we're writing for the next generation, because some of these ideals that we have are almost, Wink, correct me if I'm wrong, they're almost being, there's the pushback from this generation. So it might be the following generation where what our thoughts might actually resonate. So give some more, if you will, clarity on what I'm trying to say.
So here's the idea. Let me frame it for you. There's an old song from the 1960s by Bob Dylan. It was very popular at the time, and it spoke towards generational angst. And it went, "Come mothers and fathers all over the land. Don't criticize what you don't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your control. For the times they are changing." And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that from a racial perspective. So, for example, I look at my own family over generations. I feel that I have much more in common sometimes with my grandmother, who was born in 1897 and passed away in 1980, in the sense that my grandmother was the source of an ethos, a Lagos, if you will, on how to be in the world, self-reliance, freedom of thought, Black enterprise, life lessons learned at her elbow, which is very interesting because she's actually someone born in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, whose grandfather was a slave. And so it was very interesting that I never felt any sense of oppression, quote unquote, transmitted from my grandmother to me. Instead, what was transmitted were those kind of affirmative values of character, mindset, attitudes, and values. And then I look at, if you think of me as a sandwich generation, my father very much saw the world in black and white. My father very much criticized me, if you will, because he felt sometimes I was acting white. He felt that I had been around whites too long. And as a result, he really did not want me to go to Harvard Law School. He wanted me to go to Howard Law School, a black law school. When he thought of lawyers, he thought of Thurgood Marshall and Doug Wilder and Henry Marsh and lawyer Ralph Page, a cousin, all graduates of Howard. But I rejected that because my generation was the New South, the 1960s and the 1970s, where the big event in our life was the dismantling of public school segregation. So in the first and second grade, I attended all black schools, which were segregated. But in the third grade, through high school, schools were completely desegregated. There were no black schools or white schools. There were just schools. And so those were the impressions that were my coming of age. I was always the black kid, only black kid in my class from third grade through high school. Now, contrast my mindset with that of my daughter, who's more like my father, her grandfather. Well, let's just say that if you were to ask her this question, is blackness oppression, nothing else matters, one might wait a while for an answer. Whereas, as telling Jen earlier, if you'd asked me at the age of 15, is blackness oppression, nothing else matters, in a nanosecond I would have said no, because the universe is opened up, schools are desegregated, the larger universe is there to be engaged. So that's my idea. My idea is that people in the generation beneath us are replicating how their grandparents viewed the world and engaged the world, and that really the people in our generation will be replicated by the next generation, our grandkids and great-grandkids, because you need to have a generation grow up that is tired of social conformity. They're tired of race as being a very rigid thing. They'll feel, children always rebel against their parents. And so if the woke college kids become woke parents, their children will rebel against that constrained way of thinking about Blackness. So that's my idea. What do you think about that? Is there something to it?
I think there is. I do think there is something to it. I think that it's tricky because it's hard to navigate how much of the conformity is conformity that's particular to people growing up in a certain time, meaning right now, and how much is attributable to social media and technology, and how much is attributable to things that are particular to now, versus how much is really just cycles playing themselves out, right?
Right.
Is this time different, right? Is always the thought. But my bias is towards thinking that cycles repeat themselves more. So I'm probably more in line with the way that you would think about it than thinking it's some massive, just a transformational change. Even though I think the internet, for many reasons, I mean, I work in technology, is a complete shift. Not really on matters for me on just generationally how conformist we are about our modes of identity. What I think things like the internet do, and I know this is a tangent, but I'll bring it back, is that it's a way of which it could be a way to incubate and experiment with identity in a way that has previously not really been possible. So setting up alternative profiles, doing all of these kind of living many lives in a way online has its dangers for sure. But when done in a certain way, and I know certain people who do it incredibly intentionally, can be quite freeing and take you away from that I am one person in this body, moving through the world with this color scheme. And so I think that there are some things that actually, and this kind of goes to your point, if it's really a cultural thing, and even the tools that we make online, the applications that we make online are still a product of how we are thinking about ourselves and our identities.
Right.
Facebook was an outcome of the fact that somebody thought that you should map all of your college relationships onto the web. If someone had thought we should map something else, they would have built that product, right? And those products do get built. And so in the same way, I think that if you're growing up in a world where the cool thing is now to be more anti-conformist, then you'll probably end up with a lot more things built which support that form of behavior. And
Right.
I think those already are coming into being, just speaking in the tech space of how what kinds of products people are building. And so I think, the writing I love on generations, I wrote 2 pieces on the topic, one which was a letter from the woke to the old, and one was a letter from the old to the woke, and that was an idea. I can take no credit for it. It was Tom Wright, the editor of Persuasion, his fantastic fiction writer. He gave me the idea back when he was working there, and really encouraged it. And I think that they were really fun to write. But at the same time, so I started what I wrote in those pieces about some of the misconceptions. I also do love Louis Minand is probably my favorite living writer, or like favorite living nonfiction writer for sure. And he's somebody who he was a mentor to me at Harvard, and is someone whose classes I took and who I spent a lot of time with, and advised me. And he has many things, wonderful things he's written. But one small little piece he wrote in the New Yorker that I keep coming back to was about misconceptions about the boomer generation, the boomer culture, and exactly who created it. Because when you're talking about generations, it's so easy to associate the generation that is consuming the culture as being the one that is creating it. And oftentimes those are 2 different things. So you're consuming a culture that's been left for you by people that were maybe 10 years older than you. And there's always a time lag. And so he has this piece too called, like, Let's Stop Talking About Generations. That's not really what he's saying. I think that was the New Yorker editor probably slapped a funny title on it. I think what he's saying is, let's reframe the way we're thinking about them, whereby, of course, they're very diverse, but let's also not imagine that the people using, I don't know, Discord chat rooms, or the people who are talking about race in this way are doing so from their own collective will. And actually, it's much more they're creating artifacts that will be consumed and continued and fostered by people that come after them. So I think there could be some of what you say.
Yeah. I'm such a heretic. I am such a non-conformist. I am such a dissident. And I say that because I sometimes feel that I'm running counter to the mood of of the times. Case in point, you wrote a nice piece in Yahoo entitled "Why I'm No Longer Talking to Anyone About Anything," and I think it was prompted. You remember it, yeah? It was prompted by, I guess, another essay by a writer in Britain, Reni Eddo-Lodge. Called "Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race." Well, I violated that more and more. But could you talk about where that kind of mindset comes from? Because once again, it is so counter to how I grew up in integrated schools in the South. So could you talk about that mindset of I'm no longer talking to white people about race?
I think that one actually probably angered me even more than the common stuff. I just thought it was there's a lot of bad like racial things that get written, but like even people who I disagree with on race in the United States, at least some of them write really well, like, you know, Ta-Nehisi. This book just like I just felt it was very high schooly. I just felt it was really like, you know, someone like closing their ears like that and just going, no, I don't want to talk about it. And you know, this was I think it first came out, I wrote it in National Review and then it got reposted but I remember being at National Review and you know, in that room I was definitely the most liberal person in the room, for sure. But they were very supportive of basically writing whatever I wanted to write.
Right.
And I found this book, and I think what I gathered is that the perspective comes from this kind of like tiredness, and I think this is why it's so linked to mental health and linked to how people are passing through mental health in the modern kind of day, is that if one feels as though every day is kind of you're really having to fight an uphill battle to convince people that, one, you should be present in certain spaces, and two, that you deserve to be there, and three, that you have some merit that you are able to offer, and that, you know, you should basically just that you should convince people that you ought to be in the same rooms as them, then it's incredibly hard if you think that you're in some way unfairly persecuted or are having a time, then it's very, very easy to basically pin that on some characteristic and then say to people you would not understand, and take a kind of a moral high ground and expect people to congratulate you and clap you and profit from that. And I think that's like, it really is and the people who I see that do this most effectively are usually, you know, people from minority backgrounds, or sometimes people who aren't, who just know that it is in their self-interest to make a lot of noise about how no one can understand what they're going through. And the truth is,
it's not genuine.
Yeah, well, the truth is that if you're going through something, you ought to do your very best to explain what you're going through so people can help you. And if you don't believe that anyone can help you who's outside of your racial background, then you probably don't have very deep friendships. And like, that's just, part of this for me really came down to like, how are we thinking about what makes the kinds of relationships where you can have talks about race, where you can have talks about very sensitive subjects, where you can bring forth things about yourself that you find that you're deeply vulnerable about, including, probably most importantly, things where you look bad and things where you are open to critique because you've done something wrong. This is another kind of quirk of our racial conversation, specifically in a place like Harvard, is that there were certain spaces where if I remember submitting a piece that was basically just painted myself in a questionable light. The notion that I could have been the perpetrator of discrimination, or I could have been the perpetrator of something bad, was like heresy to contemplate. Because I think if you have a version of the self that is so, completely perfect and persecuted at the same time, then it's never your fault, and there's never anything that you could have done. And so you end up in a world where you're moving through the world, you're not feeling good, you're feeling like you're having to justify your presence, and you're feeling deeply anxious about that. But you're not, your ideology doesn't allow you to A, turn to people who might be able to help, or B, look at yourself and think what you could do to improve yourself. And so you're left in this very, I think, quite harrowing, difficult situation that I would not want to exist in at all. I think it would be quite deranging. And so I think like these books, that book is like just a characteristic example of, oh, you don't get it, I have no obligation to talk to you, but also I'm going to complain about it, and I'm going to feel really bad about it, and I probably won't feel good about it either. And it gives you no way, and it gives you no place to go at all. There's nowhere to get to, and there's no mediums with which to get there.
How would James Baldwin have received that book?
Yeah, I think he would have giggled at first. It's funny because I was watching an interview with him and Mavis Mikkelsen last night. Was this fantastic interviewer who also interviewed David Bowie very well, and she was asking him about love, and he was talking about the homosexual question back then, and how basically love knows no bounds. And he just kind of like picturing him now, like I've spent a lot of time, obsessed with James Baldwin's writings, and I think the thing that I can imagine him saying is a kind of a wry smile and a bit of a laugh, and saying like, of course, most white people can't talk about race and should not talk about race, but neither should most black people, right? And he was always,
that's good.
Something like that. He'd say, and probably neither should you, right? And he that long kind of like pause that he would put at the end of his sentences,
right?
And I think he'd say, look, if you can't have a conversation, then like, what are we doing here, right? Like, I mean, this is the fundamental thing. It's like, he has this great bit in one of his essays. I can't remember if I cut this part from the piece because it was a 10,000 word piece when I first wrote it, but it was, I remember writing about, he was teaching at this school in a rough part of LA, and effectively the kids at the school were, they were like talking about each other's hair color, they were laughing at each other, they were from all kinds of different races, and he was like, there is a beauty in the complete obliviousness these people have towards these different characteristics, and doing anything, maybe they're not talking about race, but that's kind of the point. So maybe the thing you'd say is, maybe the end state is we don't want to talk to white people about race because we don't want to be talking about race much at all. In order to get there, we probably have to say quite a bit about race, right? We have to say quite a bit about race with the right people. And if you're not willing to talk, you won't be heard. And so you have an obligation, if you care any amount, to do that conversing, even if you can't be bothered, and even if those are really tricky conversations to have.
Sure. One of the mysteries, I think, in our correspondence, in our upcoming book, Jen, has been, I remember maybe the first exchange or two, Jen tried to use a slogan word. Remember white privilege. And I told Jen, we can't talk if you're going to use words like that, because no one's privileged. I'm not privileged from you. You're not privileged from me. And so we needed to get beyond that slogan word to really open up and exchange many, many thoughts about race. And I would say that over the course of 4 years, that was only the really time that there was a danger to our ability to talk about race. Would you agree, Jen, that was probably the only moment when there was a real danger or obstacle?
Yeah. I would say we had many obstacles, but that one was the one to even start the conversation. The conversation wouldn't have started.
That's right.
I think that was one of the areas where we decided to it energized our writing, because for me, Sahil, the reason that Wink and I started writing in the first place, just as a little bit of background, is I went to a city of Austin. I live in Austin, Texas, one of their diversity training programs. This was before George Floyd. This was before it really became mainstream. And so Sahil, to go back to something you and I were talking about earlier, this was where I'd just gotten back from China, and I realized, I was kind of looking at the world looking at the United States in particular and going, what are these conversations we're having that are tearing us apart? And I started to apply my work in China and my work in international relations to the United States. And so I said to myself, well, if I'm going to understand it, I've got to actually do one of these diversity trainings. And again, this is before it became mainstream. And I thought I was really excited. I went into it hopeful. I was like, I'm going to hear voices that I hadn't heard from before. I'm going to gain empathy. I'm going to have new understandings. It's going to open my eyes. And it was...
So it's just going to open up.
I was so excited. I was actually really excited. I was like, I'm going to talk to people I've never heard from. And unbeknownst to me, I went into this true naivete. And it was 2 full days of talking about how bad white people were. And we had to do everything that you've heard, the horror stories of. We had to do a privilege score and stand in line with, placards across our chests. Very similar to what, I had studied about the Cultural Revolution and how you do that, kind of stand up with your whatever crime is across your chest. So, anyways, that's how that all started. So Wink, I wrote a piece about this in Ariel magazine, and Wink responded to it. And so we started writing this back and forth. And I'm still in this mindset. I'm shell shocked, if you will. I'm like, well, maybe, this idea of white privilege is new to me. I was open to exploring it, open to learning things that I didn't know before. But, Wink stopped me right there and said, if we can't have a conversation without using the language of the day that is shaping how we even communicate, then I don't know that we can continue this correspondence. And then but Wink, I'll say that was a challenge, but at the same time, it was it was an opportunity for me to say, tell me more. To which you did tell me more. And from there on out, and more. And we've talked so much. We did a conference recently on this idea of what is exactly privilege, and really looking into that word. Yeah. And I think that it is to only say that there's white privilege and to only focus on that belies a nuance and complexity to the world that we're living in now, and does not allow for greater understanding.
And so my motivation for entering into and starting to write the book was very simple. So a little bit about my background, where I grew up, pride, achievement, enterprise. That's how I kind of viewed Blackness when I thought about it. To be honest, I didn't really think about it in the 70s and 80s. I was far more focused on other things. But one day, I think it was April 21st, 2018, it was such a noteworthy day, I wrote it down, recorded it for all time. A relative, a young relative, we were having a conversation about race, and a young relative said to me, Blackness is oppression. Nothing else matters. And that was so, what's the word? It was like the world turned upside down when the Patriots defeated the British at Yorktown in 1781. It was such an upending thought to me, particularly coming from someone who has had many, shall we say, privileges, to use a slogan word. And so I just thought something is amiss in the land, and I need to write about it. And then at that time, I read Jen's article, and the rest is history. So that was my motivation. I've never understood the appeal of slogan words. I actively reject slogan words. And in fact, I think the little part I can do to make the world a better place is to, whenever I can in conversations with people, when people throw out a word, which is a slogan word like white privilege or systemic this or institutional that, just to say, stop. I don't have allies, I have friends. And if you redirect the conversation in the moment, it can lead to a deeper exchange of ideas. But I find if you allow words to be manipulated, if you allow people to frame discussions, it's not very deep, it's not very satisfying, and I kind of feel like there's not much there. So that's one of the joys of writing this book is we throw the slogan words in the trash can, and we talk like people used to talk back in the day, in the 60s and the 70s.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
It's interesting. It's funny because the words thing is real. I was teaching a round table I'm a visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins, and I was there this last week for an evening with a group of really fantastic students who basically all wanted to talk about the intellectual climate on campus. And the first person who said anything at the round table was the only freshman in the room. And it must have been incredibly daunting for her. She was an international student, a student of color. And even as I'm saying those things, I mean, the first words she said something about intersectionality. And I was like, oh God, here we go. Right? But weirdly enough, it felt like she just said the word to say it, because then
just everything, to say it, right?
The whole thing was fantastic. Like, and she was incredibly, incredibly smart and had really nuanced perspectives. And I think that it's weird. I think the words are said as rituals. It's the very much like the George Orwell politics, the English language.
Yes.
Thing, where you can say certain words and you can own those words. And so when I use the words privilege, I am meaning specifically, this is a very specific thing. This is a privilege. Mm-hmm. This is a benefit that I automatically have that I do not, or that you do not. And I feel privileged because of it. I feel privileged to be living in New York because I know that my friends back home in the UK want to be here. They don't have a visa. That is a privilege, right? So it's the very clear examples of these things. But if I'm staying, and this is the problem when you combine two words like blackness and oppression, you combine words like white and privilege, you end up in a scenario where you can't ever say anything specific, and then you can never truly know what you're saying because these words have such connotations right outside. So like a good example of this is the phrase Black Lives Matter. Like this is another one of those phrases that when you say that, let's say you go into 12 different rooms, you go into one like pub or bar, you go into one like conservative newsroom, you go into, I mean, just like different places, right? And you say those words. not the perspectives on the movement, but just what you're talking about. But when you say those words, is completely different in different people's minds. They completely. You're either talking about a movement run by a bunch of anti-Semites in some people's mind, or you're talking about something that's got no relation to the movement whatsoever and is just an anti-racist statement that gets puts on the advertisements in big sports stadiums, and you just see, and that you hold in your, and it's like a confirmation of something. Like some people don't even know about the movement that exists, and some people have very different perspectives on, is that movement the protests, or is it the founders, or is it based in California, is it? And so when you say words like that in the context of trying to have any kind of meaningful conversation, you've either got to very clearly define what exactly you're talking about, or you're better off just not using the words.
What will it take for us to move beyond a world where those kind of words are predominant? I mean, if you look at any institution or association in the U.S. today, there's certain words, we know the words, they're just predominant. They frame the discourse, and either one conforms and one is in the party and one can punch their ticket, or one doesn't conform, but you remain silent. And then, as Jen said earlier, silence equals conformity, or you become a dissident. I mean, is that our future? Do we have to become like Soviet dissidents of yore to undercut American conformity today?
It's weird because I think the difference I would take, and I think some people on I guess my side of the aisle on these matters would disagree with this, but I think we had plenty of dissidents. It's just a lot of them aren't in the institutions that we're speaking about, whether that's universities, or whether that's big tech, or whether that's cultural industry in certain cities, right? Like those are really the places where it's working, and that's why I push back on people on my side when they say all of America is under the siege of political correctness and you had Donald Trump in the White House until not too long ago. Like, let's be real, right? But I do think, that's not to say these questions don't matter if they're in elite institutions of education, technology, and places like that, because those are massively important places. And so what I would say is the hope in me is that, you have a much tighter feedback loop between those places and the places outside. And so that you can't get away with the impoverished. I mean, some of the worst written emails, I have a lot of wonderful things to say about Harvard as a place, but some of the worst written emails that I've gotten are from the kind of administration, right? And some of those administrators, the ones at the top, are fantastic. I have nothing but lovely things to say about some of the deans there. Yeah. But I've been sent emails about racial and cultural signage on the campus and they've been 2,000 word emails using every one of those buzzwords you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
Really, what they could have just said in 2 sentences was, given the history of the school and where we are in this moment, we're going to take down portraits of white people and replace them with portraits of black people. That would have been a better way of phrasing it instead of the 2,000 words about racial and cultural signage.
Right.
And then we could have had an actual debate about that, because I'm not inherently opposed, off the bat, to doing that. I'd actually be interested in the specific talking about it. Right. But I think unless you have leaders that model clear, concise ways of talking through issues, you can't expect students to do it. So I think that's what I would want inside the university, is just more of that clear, concise. And then it's also about teaching people or modeling, because it's hard to teach this, but modeling, 1, how to talk, but 2, how to write, and how to write in such a way that you can be unsure of your perspective on an opinion and still put something down that doesn't scare you or doesn't makes you think that you've said something that you would be okay reading in 6 months. And I think that's something which we don't teach or model good writing and good thinking and good conversation regularly enough. But I think people learn so much by imitation and mimesis, or whatever you want to call it. Mimesis is very popular in the tech world in terms of what people speak about. But I would say because of that, if the cool kids are the ones speaking in a certain way, posturing in a certain way, then that's going to be the thing that is aspirational, and that's what people will copy. And if the administration does it, the same applies. Whereas if there are people who are really have cultural cachet, have social cachet, lead the lives you want to live, and especially speaking for young people, are going to the parties that you might want to go to, and they're the ones modeling that kind of behavior, then you're in a game where, okay, now I'm going to maybe adjust my tone and speak in a different way and have a bit more confidence to speak on something that I don't quite know my final perspectives on.
Now, that's a good point. That's a good point. I wanted to ask you a quick question. In one of your pieces, I forget which one it was, I think it might have been about generations, you said that of 7,000 Harvard students, only 50 were actually activists. Do you still stand by that? That seems a little bit low to me, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think, it depends. It depends how we kind of slice the pie. I think there was probably 5 to 10% of students were I think probably 5% of students actually cared enough to say things about these issues and say them quite vociferously. A lot of people would kind of fall in line. I was exposed to quite a lot of it because I was moving in a lot of arts circles and a lot of like both the arts clubs and social clubs, and also the humanities and social sciences in terms of departments. When I ask my friends from econ and from computer science about the same things, they give you a lower figure, I think, because there's more apathy in those parts.
Yeah.
And this is one of the fascinating things that came out of the Johns Hopkins conversation, was that there was more apathy across the board there. And it's an interesting question. Would you rather have the tone of debate that we have now, or would you rather have apathy? And that's I think that's worth thinking through. But on the Harvard campus, I would say that there were kind of groups of 5 to 10% that cared and probably had perspectives that were manifesting in really, not like distortive and destructive ways. And then the majority people were just like making the right noise, or like not saying that they wanted to say, and kind of just existing and not wanting to cause too much of a fuss.
Wink and I were talking about that before you got on, where I think you just hit the nail on the head, that silence is conformity is what I was saying, but you put it in the words of like, what is worse is apathy worse than the 10% that may be taking are the loudest voices, so the apathetic, I think, have a role to play in perpetuating the loudest voices that are making the most noise. And on that note, and you've kind of addressed this in several different ways, but final question for you, particularly going kind of back to the generations. And I love your essay on the different generations and the letters to the older generation and the younger generation. This question has two parts to it. I think the first is, what currently, in our current moment right now, what is the most illiberal trend that worries you the most? And what is the liberalism that you're seeing currently that gives you the most hope?
That's a really good question. I think there's a lot of hope. I think the more funny, I still do a lot of work in the providing insurance as well, but because I'm spending a lot of my time now around people in technology, I'm drawn immediately to the fact that I think there is the form of liberalism that I love and really admire is, I know I've mentioned David Bowie's name a bunch of times, but more
Yes.
this kind of imaginative, like really imaginative, somewhat like extremely charismatic, somewhat sexy form of liberalism where it's fun. You know, it's really fun. Like, I think one of my favorite Louis Hernandez essays is he wrote this critique of Christopher Lash that's in the New York Review of Books. It's fantastic. And he tries to paint this thing where if it's possible to paint the conservatism as the boring stuff and the liberalism as the fun, countercultural stuff, that's how you win, you know? And I think that's true. And I think the fear that I find, that my actual greatest threat to liberalism, like you said, is for me probably some forms of technocracy. And so maybe that's less about conformity, but I think they're tied together. I think basically the idea that you can do away with people's individual opinions by outsourcing decision-making to some centralized entity, whether that's a global institution or whether that's an AI thing or global governance system, that to me feels like the biggest threat, because the thing that I really value is people individually coming to conceptions of themselves that they think are true and right, and then being able to express and exert imprint themselves upon the world in really beautiful ways. And so this comes from two angles. One, you need to give people the ability to come to that self-conception. And at the same time, you need to set up political institutions and other vehicles such that they can do the imprinting. And so my greatest fear is that we're kind of, because there is not that that debate, the default is that people are conformists, we might as well just play politics on automatic mode, right? And just turn democracy into a Tesla, and just thing run itself. And I think that's the part that I probably fear. The part that I'm inspired by is a lot of it is people really experimenting with new forms of both identity and forms of governance in small ways. I have three close friends of mine, all women, that were running this non-profit called the Collective Intelligence Project, just thinking about alternative forms of democracy and how we do it better. There are loads of people I know doing hard work and just having hard conversations on the campus between different groups. And I think just people that are really being brave and saying not the unpopular thing for the sake of saying the unpopular thing, but trying to listen very deeply to what people are saying and then gesture towards alternatives as they're thinking them out loud. And I think so. It's in some ways vague, but I think that's the liberalism I want. Is one that is really fun and somewhat on the edge, and you don't always say the right thing, but you all know that what your goal is freedom, but freedom in a way that is not me as an individual getting away from society and being free, but more freedom that is built by a collective that is only possible because of what's been built by that collective. So not a libertarian freedom, but like a liberal freedom. And that has a whole set of other people to go and read and people to go and think about in terms of that debate. But that's what I would love to see.
Can you leave us with a David Bowie quote?
Yeah.
Oh,
well, okay.
God, yeah,
First of all, before that, I will make sure.
Keep it there.
I will make sure that we link to, because your David Bowie piece was so much fun to read.
Yes,
well, I'll link to
definitely.
a whole host of your work, Sahil, but I had so much fun
highly
reading
recommend
that.
if people have not watched. There's a film out about him right now called Moon Age Daydream. I've recommended it so many times. It's not a documentary; it's a montage film, beautifully shot. It's won a bunch of awards, but it is stunning. It is so good. I think it was playing downstairs in a hotel movie theater in the basement next door to where we live for like a few months, and I went back so many times just bringing different and watch it. So it's definitely amazing. But yeah, David Bowie. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is not one of his super profound ones. Those are more in the piece. But one of the ones I heard for very early that I thought was really fun is he was talking about how this could be contained, forging a spirituality for himself, doing all of these things, and he was saying how he was a Buddhist on Tuesday and he was into Nietzsche by Friday. And I thought that was pretty funny because so many people I know who I love, who's basically each time you meet them, it's like they've become a new person because they've been reading and surrounding themselves with so many new things, and doing it with a real level of seriousness. So that's a fun one. But he's a mountain full of so many wonderful quotes and wonderful things, both in his songs, in his scripts, in his paintings, and then just in his words. So if you can watch interviews or watch this film, yeah.
And I think that he really exemplifies this idea that we are not monolithic. And not only are we not monolithic based on like color, race, gender, whatever, but we're not monolithic day to day. I mean, who I was yesterday does not mean, So I love that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he was so good at, I have this line at the end of my piece about a chameleon who learns more about himself and the world each time he changes the color of his skin. And the reason that that's important to me is that it's not this world in which you're changing characters and losing all of your morals and just doing this. And he lost himself a few times where he was that, where he pushed it too far. He forgot who he was. Drugs played a role in that for sure. Like a bunch of things played a role in that. But the place where he was most himself was when he could combine all of those characters, but there was some root beneath that was a persona and individual that was being strengthened through each of these characters that he played. And so I think that's important, to have that continuous sense of self, but have it be compounded and elaborated and expanded by all the different microcosms of mind and then of the external portrayal of yourself that you could possibly do, just to see how it feels, and also to bring you into closer connection with people who choose a different outward, appearance or a different perception. So that's the version of it that I love, and it gives me a lot of sympathy for a lot of the truly liberal, anti-essentialists, both in gender, race, a bunch of these things that you can possibly think of. Each one has its own complexities, but this idea of we are more than our labels, and we can create our own labels, and we can live many, 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 many lives, and meet many, many, many people. That's a wonderful, I think, sentiment that he's so eloquently kind of espoused for the world.
And meeting you has been wonderful. Thank you. I'm so grateful for your time, so grateful for your work and your insight, and hope that this is the first of many more encounters.
Absolutely. Yeah, please keep me posted. Thank you very much. It's been lovely to hear about your backgrounds and what brought you to the work that you're doing. And any way I can help, please let me know. And yeah, would love to do more of these. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah,
very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.